All right, welcome in everybody. Tony Patelis here, the host of the College Hoop News podcast. This is weekly recap number 4. Myself and my guests tonight will be breaking down all that's happened in the college basketball world this week. This past week's been very exciting. There's a lot to talk about. My guest this week is making his first appearance on the podcast, Erik Haslam from HaslamMetrics.com. You can also check him out on Twitter at HaslamMetrics. Erik, how are you tonight?
Doing well. How are you, Tony?
Good. I appreciate you coming on. There's plenty to talk about. So, Erik, before we get started, just give a little background on yourself, talk about your site. How does your site actually work and all that good stuff?
Yeah, so what it all started out with was, many years ago, we're talking about a decade back, I just decided I wanted a better way to actually rate all these teams across different conferences. I got sick and tired of going to the USA Today every March Madness and looking at all the team capsules in there and trying to decipher who was who without knowing. It was basically all very subjective. A lot of different people with a lot of different opinions, and I was relying on their opinions. And I said, you know what? I kind of want to start doing things my way, looking at it from an analytics standpoint, and then trying to rate these teams in a variety of different categories. Well, I kind of taught myself a lot of different statistics about analytics, started doing a lot of analytics the way a lot of different analytics experts do it in pro basketball and college basketball. And after a while, I kind of just decided, hey, I want to kind of do things my way. So I kind of wiped the slate clean a little bit and decided, hey, I want to do it this way, and I want to eliminate this data, and I want to weight it this way. And I just kind of started building this up, brick by brick. And it started with ratings, and then I added in estimates, and I added in the bracketology stuff. And over time, it's like I said, it's brick by brick. And after a while, you step back and look at all you've done, and you kind of built a castle. So it's kind of fun for me. It's really great. It really serves the purpose of what I tried to accomplish from the start. But at the same time, it's great for me. I love waking up every day. I love seeing what the algorithms kick out as far as the results. So a lot of people are looking forward to what I have from one day to the next. I'm just as big a fan. I don't control what the analytics spit out. I just tell them how to process the data. So it's just something that over time it's kind of grown from a little bit to something a little bit bigger, and get a lot more followers on Twitter. It's really kind of a great run for me. It's a lot of fun.
Absolutely, you're doing a very good job. Obviously, you just hit 2,000 followers, so congrats on that. So let's talk about your rankings real quick. Why don't you share with us your top 10 right now? Can you do that?
Well, the top 10, and let me tell you something up front about the top 10. The sample size is still relatively small.
Right.
And I always want to caution people that because we're only a month into the season. And the thing about my ratings is every single one of the 351 Division I teams are treated as exact equals on day one. I don't tell the algorithm, hey, give Duke the nod here or Kentucky the nod here, or hey, this is North Carolina A&T, ignore them. It doesn't know that. It has to learn throughout the season who is who. So as time goes along, I don't feed it anything about recruiting data. I don't feed it last year's data. It's all based on this season. So going in order right now, and some of these you're going to say, okay, that one makes sense, but some of these other ones you're going to go, wow, that team's up there. That's kind of weird. Right. Again, I caution you, it's early, it's learning. It may be right at the end of the day. One of the things I've learned about analytics is it's a little bit leading. I'll talk about this. There's something called what I call the 10th man mentality that I can talk about here in a little bit. But keep that in mind. Some of these things, some of these teams that I show up in the top 10 might actually be something, teams that we're going to be talking about in 2 months. Like, wow, they came out of nowhere. Right. The analytics tend to reveal these a little earlier than the eye test do. So what I have is number 1 team in the country right now is Villanova. And this is going into today. Number 1 is Villanova. Number 2 is Kansas. Number 3 is Virginia. Number 4 is Tennessee. Number 5 is North Carolina. Number 6 is Texas A&M. Number 7 is Michigan State. Number 8 is Gonzaga. Number 9 is Purdue. And number 10 is Wichita State.
Okay, so generally, I'd say about 9 out of the 10 you mentioned are fairly in that top 15 of the regular rankings, correct?
That's correct, and I think the exception you'll probably pick out of there is probably Tennessee.
Right. Tennessee is really high on that list. It's a team that I was very fond of all off season. I thought Rick Barnes did a pretty good job last year. I know they kind of faltered down the stretch, but they got a really good big in Grant Williams. They got a lot of guards. They're pesky on defense. Do you like this Tennessee team as well, Erik?
Love them. I think the defense, the reason why, and the thing is, they're ranked number one in defensive efficiency for me right now. Wow. And you look at a lot of other analytics sites, and you're going to say, well, Virginia's number one, and I look at Tennessee, and they're pretty good, but they're maybe 15th or 20th. I decided to look into it a little bit more and say, why are they first? Well, it's an easy reason to figure out. What my site does that other sites do not is it truncates that scrub data. So when a game is deemed mathematically over, I stop looking at the data. And a big reason why Tennessee is number one is because their best efforts this year were in games, and granted, they were playing weak teams, but they literally destroyed these weak teams. And it was, I had the information here in front of me somewhere. It was, games against Presbyterian and High Point. Now, Presbyterian and High Point are not great teams. They're 309th or 326th and 309th, respectively. But in those games, the offensive efficiency that Tennessee limited those teams to was out of this world. They limited Presbyterian to 14 first-half points. They limited High Point to 13 first-half points. They literally led by about 40 at the half of those games. And as a result, those games were marked over literally 2 minutes into the second half. Now, what a lot of other analytics sites are going to do is they're going to take all of that entire game data when Tennessee probably went to their bench, put their game, team manager on the floor, and they're going to count that in their numbers. I don't necessarily care about that. I only want to see when the best players are on the court, and that's how Tennessee rises up to first in defensive efficiency because of that.
Right. And speaking of another team in that top 10 you have is Kansas. With a loss today at home, how much do you think that'll affect their ranking come, tomorrow?
I don't think it's going to hurt them too bad because Arizona State is 18th. And normally when those situations, when you lose to a team similar in ranking like that, it's not going to hurt you that bad. Now, they're going to, my guess is they're going to still be in the top 10 tomorrow. They may be even, in the neighborhood of 5th or 6th. Mm-hmm. But, they're still at number 2 going into the day, and that was largely because they were so far ahead of everybody, and the way they performed in their first 7 games was, far beyond anybody else, ahead of anybody else. In fact, at one point last week, if you had a neutral court simulation between Kansas and Villanova, I believe Kansas was favored by double digits.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
That's how well they performed in their first 7 games. But then out of nowhere, here comes Washington, and a game I can't quite explain. Washington, who was 98th going into that game, comes in and beats the hell out of Kansas in Kansas City by 9. Yeah. And then you had the hangover today where Kansas was beaten, on their own home court by Arizona State, who granted is a very good team. So just when you think you've got everything figured out, Kansas was well ahead of the field a week ago, and now they've got 2 straight losses, and who knows if they're going to still be in the top 10.
I know, well, they're having major depth issues. They have no depth right now. And again, just like last year, they're having a front court depth issue as well. They have Udoka Azubuike up there, but there's really nobody behind him. Mitch Lightfoot doesn't really give them that much. And that's been a big issue for this team. They really need Sam Cumliff to get, become eligible, which he will be soon. And also Billy Preston hasn't played. He got into that situation. He missed a curfew before the opening night, and we thought, he's going to miss the first game and he'll be back. He still hasn't played yet. So that's a very interesting situation, and they definitely need those 2 guys right now because they are lacking in the depth department big time. And
I completely agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just mention too, Tennessee was picked 13th in the SEC preseason. So
isn't that unbelievable? The less we know, the more we know,
Right. And I think people forget though, Erik, this team was in the NCAA tournament discussion for quite a while last year.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They were just on the outside. I don't think they might have maybe made it into my playing game very briefly, but yeah, they hovered right around the first 8 teams out there for a good chunk of February and March. So, there's a lot of these teams that are really just need to take a step forward in maturity. Then all of a sudden they become extremely good basketball teams. And Tennessee is one of those that so far has delivered, 7-1. They had, the one loss to Villanova, but, they hung with Villanova much of that game. They built a very early first half lead, and then Villanova chewed it up, but they hung with them late in the game. But on top of that, they have a win over Purdue, and the analytics love Purdue. Purdue is an excellent basketball team. They beat North Carolina State by 9, and that's a team that took down Arizona. So yeah, there's some nice wins in there for Tennessee. Tennessee it's not like they haven't played anybody. They've got some nice wins in there, and they've got some great ability on that team and a great defense.
Absolutely, absolutely. So another team I wanted to talk about, I think we have to talk about, is Arizona State. Arizona State's maybe one of the most surprising teams in college basketball this year. I for one thought they would be improved on last year, but I didn't think they'd be this good. I mean, they're 9-0. They have wins over Xavier, wins over Kansas now. You know, they're an explosive basketball team. They really can score. You know, the defense was the main issue last year for them. They were just horrific on defense. They couldn't stop anybody. They're better this year. They're not perfect, but they're better, and they can really score the basketball. They have guards all over the floor, Trey Holder, Shannon Evans, Remy Martin was really, really good today. What do you think about this Arizona State club this year?
Love them. I think one of the questions is, are they contenders or are they pretenders? Definitely contenders. I mean, you don't just do what they did to Xavier and knock off Xavier by 16 on a neutral court. You don't play San Diego State, who's a pretty darn good team, and beat them by 22. Right. And on top of that, that was all before today, before they went to Kansas and beat Kansas on the road. Definitely for real. And like you said, their defense was an issue last year. It continues to be an issue, but it's not nearly the issue it was last year.
No. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Eric. Sorry about that.
No, I was going to say, last year they were 229th in defensive efficiency. So far this year, they're 155th. But more importantly, the offensive end of the floor. They were 59th last year, which is pretty solid. This year, number one in offensive efficiency. They're number one at getting to the free throw line. They're number one in field goal percentage.
I had that written down. You know, they're 52% field goal percentage as a team and also 41% from three. So that's really, really good.
Yeah, but I have them 9th in adjusted three-point percentage. So when I say adjusted, you know, all these percentages, like, for example, I said they're first in field goal percentage. You may look it up on NCAA.com and say, well, they're not number 1, they're number 4, number 6. My stuff is adjusted, again, keep in mind, for based on who they've played. And then, again, we truncate those game minutes when the game is no longer in doubt.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they can just nail it. They're just deadly from three-point land. And when you got so many guys that can knock down those shots, can't really double team anybody, it makes, you know, a nightmare for the other team.
Yeah, just a very impressive resume so far. Those 3 wins coming into the day: Xavier, San Diego State, and St. John's. Really nice wins. And now you add the coup de grace, which is the win over Kansas. Just really great wins.
You could make an argument they have the best resume in college basketball, correct?
Absolutely. I think I think they will tomorrow, because coming into the day, I do something that's called record quality. It's similar to RPI, but it's my own flavor, my own recipe to determine how good a record quality is. And Arizona State's coming into the day was 2nd, and they just knocked off the number 2 team in the country according to my metrics. So boy, I'm thinking they're probably going to be first tomorrow.
Definitely. All right, so a couple conferences I wanted to talk to you about, and both of them have been very disappointing so far. The first one is the Big Ten and also the Atlantic 10. Starting with the Big Ten, you know, for me, Iowa has been a major disappointment. I kind of pegged them as a top 25, top 5 Big Ten team. They're, I think, 5-6 right now. They've been really bad out of the gate. You know, Wisconsin, you know, is a team that I thought definitely would take a step back, but I didn't think they'd be 4-7 after their first 11 games. Northwestern is 5-4. They were a really team that was looked upon to be maybe even a top 20 team heading into this season. Right now, it's just kind of Purdue, Michigan State, Minnesota. I guess you could still put in that group at the top. But what do you think about this conference? How disappointing has it been in your opinion?
Oh, extreme. Oh, I wouldn't say extremely disappointed, because you still have some powerful teams at the top. Michigan State has proven to be what we've expected them to be. I think Purdue is a very capable team. But yes, some of these other ones, the ones that came out of nowhere last year, specifically 2 teams, Minnesota and Northwestern, have been extremely disappointing. I mean, especially Northwestern. Looking from an overall standpoint, Minnesota is right now 42nd. That's okay. They're 8-3. That's not. There's some talent there, and it's early, like I said. But when you look at Northwestern, sitting there at 5-4, ranked 94th, they have regressed, and they've really regressed defensively. That's the problem. The the big deal, what did they lose last year? You start to say, well, what was the difference? What made them so successful last year that isn't there this year? And the one that jumped out at me was Sanjay Lumpkin, who was one of the team's best defenders.
Right.
Now, all of a sudden, he's not around anymore, and look what's happened. Northwestern is 158th in defensive efficiency. And last year, they were, let me pull that up real quick, they were 32nd.
Wow.
That's a significant. So they are really, really struggling. I don't think anybody expected Northwestern to fall like they have. I mean, they just have not performed. It's more what you would have expected out of Northwestern last year. But last year they stepped up, and this year they've regressed.
Yeah, definitely.
And to a certain, yep.
No, go ahead.
And to a certain degree, to a certain degree, Minnesota has as well. I think Minnesota, like I said, they're 42nd right now. Most of us would have expected them to be a top 15, top 20 team. Right. Now, that's not to say they won't be at some point, because some teams come out of the block slow, but Minnesota right now is just not doing it.
Yeah, you got to say, though, 2 of their 3 losses weren't that bad. I mean, they lost to Miami at home, who's a top 10 team. They lost at Arkansas, who looks like a possible top 25 team. So really can't take much away from those losses. They did lose to Nebraska, who's not a very good club, but I'm still not panicking on Minnesota, although they haven't looked great lately. 2 other teams I wanted to talk to you about and see where you have them in your rankings. Ohio State's been a very big surprise. I thought they'd be a really bad team this year. Chris Holtman comes in. He's doing a really good job with this club. Where do you have Ohio State in your rankings right now?
I have Ohio State very, very high, and they're 12th right now, but I can explain why they are. I mean, you look at what they've done, and they've got that bad loss. I mean, granted, it's Gonzaga, a good team, but they got blown out by Gonzaga. And then there was that 14-point loss to Clemson, who's 34th, so it's not a bad loss. But the reason Ohio State is so high right now, and this is why I always say I just tell people, give it a little bit of time, because everything's going to come out in the wash as the season goes along. But that Wisconsin game was extremely impactful. Wisconsin, granted, they're not nearly as good as they have been in the past, but they're still a top 100 team. Ohio State went into Madison, and that game was over before we hit the 12-minute mark with 12 minutes to go in the second half. It was 66-33 at one point. So Ohio State's rating in that game blew up. It was a plus 53.1 as of today. That's a very, very, very high rating. And that explains kind of why Ohio State is as high as they are. You can't discount those games. A lot of people say, well, take out the best game and their worst game and see where they are. I don't like to do that. I think every game matters, and you have to include everything. And Wisconsin, who has hung with some, pretty decent teams, they hung with Baylor. They hung with UCLA, right to the end. With Ohio State just blew them out of the water. It wasn't even close. It was laughable. And that's largely the reason why Ohio State is as high as they are. But as the weeks go by, we're going to see if Ohio State's for real the next couple weeks, because you can't just hang up at number 12 and, start beating teams like Rutgers by 4 points. You're going to suffer if you do that. So once you hit a higher level, once you hit a higher ranking, that is, the expectations of beating teams get that much higher. So you better take a team like Rutgers and beat them by 30, or you better take a team like Michigan and beat them by 8. That's the expectation of the analytics at that point.
Absolutely. And the other team I wanted to ask you about is Michigan. Michigan is a very interesting team to me, because I get so many conflicting opinions on Michigan. Either you really like Michigan or you don't. Where do you have Michigan in your rankings this week?
Right now, Michigan's at 41, and they're 8-3, almost 7-4. They escaped with that win over UCLA yesterday. But I would say they're probably another team that's been a little bit of a disappointment, because last year, remember, they got hot. There were 2 teams in the NCAA who got red hot at the end of last season. Michigan was one, Iowa State was the other. And Michigan ended up the season somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 15 in there, going near the end of the season and right around tournament time. They could end up there again, but right now they have not followed up on last year. And granted, they lost some guys, but still, at the same time, they have not delivered like I expected Michigan to deliver. In fact, the Big Ten, with the exception of Purdue and Michigan State, really, I'm trying to think if there's anybody else I'm missing. Those are the 2 that stand out, and then there's a big fall off from those 2 to number 3.
Yeah, for sure.
I believe Maryland is number 3, I believe, right now for me.
Yeah, Maryland's a team that kind of like Michigan. I get a lot of conflicting opinions on Maryland. Some think they're an NIT team. Some think they're an NCAA tournament team. In the long run, I still feel like this conference is going to get at least 5 or 6 NCAA bids. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think they're getting at least 5. I mean, you're going to get Michigan State, Purdue. Maryland's a good bet. Michigan's a good bet. Minnesota's a good bet. And then you're probably getting maybe one other one.
Maybe Northwestern can figure things out and
possibly, yeah,
for sure.
I don't think it's going to be Wisconsin. We talked about Wisconsin briefly. Boy, is that team's a mess. That team is. Some people don't know that I do some scouting reports for teams. One of them is Wisconsin, and looking at how to beat Marquette yesterday, I consider Marquette to be a very much a one-trick pony. It was almost shocking to me how poorly they handled Marquette in that game yesterday. And the problem is with Wisconsin is their offense is really struggling right now. Part of it is their three-point. They don't have Koenig around. They don't have Showalter around anymore. They're 296th in adjusted three-point percentage.
We talked about it all off season, Eric. People said, this team will be fine, their system and everything. But when you lose 4 senior starters and 2 guys like Hayes and Koenig who did pretty much everything for you, it's tough to overcome. Yeah. It really is. I mean, Ethan Happ's a very good player, but he's pretty much surrounded with just, solid role players. There's really no other impact guys on that roster.
No, I think Davison has some potential. Yeah. But the problem is you saw it yesterday, when the ball goes into Happ, everybody doubles down on Happ because what they're going to dare the other 4 guys to do something. And what I saw yesterday against Marquette early in the game was the ball went into Happ and you had 4 other guys standing idly with their toes on the three-point line, not cutting, not doing anything, standing there at the three-point line where they shoot, a very poor percentage. Right. So I think Wisconsin, if they're going to succeed, they got to find a way to change their way of thinking offensively because they can't win this way.
Absolutely not. And now they lose Demetric Christ to a foot injury, so that doesn't help the situation.
Yeah, they're in a lot of trouble. They're in deep trouble, I think.
Definitely. I think that NCAA tournament streak might end this year, unfortunately. But let's move on here, Eric. I wanted to talk about the A10. This is a league that, a handful of years ago was getting multi-bids, 4, I think, NCAA bids, maybe even 5 at some point. This year, for me, I'm actually already confident saying that this might be a one-bid league. I really believe that. I don't see any of these teams having the non-conference resume other than Rhode Island to, really garner any attention for an at-large bid. What do you think about the A10?
I was thinking the same thing earlier today, and I look at the A10, in 2017 at the end of the year, the top ranked team that I had of all of them was Rhode Island at 35. Dayton was 47, VCU was 55. That was at the end of the 2017 season. This year, the top-rated team in the A10 is Rhode Island at 55. Wow. VCU is 68, St. Bonaventure 74. I wanted to figure. I knew this question was going to be coming, so I kind of wanted to do a little research today. So I said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at my rankings, and I'm going to take the average, looking at all the biggest conferences I can look at, and see what the average ranking of the top 5 teams is. And A10 right now, and to give you an idea of some of the other other conferences, the ACC is 16. SEC is right about 15. Big 12 is 17. Big East is 20. So you're in that range of 17 to 20. You want to take a guess what the A10 is? The average of the top 5, 79.
Oh,
that's way to put things in perspective. Conference USA is 65.8. Wow. The top 5 in the A10 is 79. That is roughly just barely above the MVC, which is right around 80. And we're not talking about an MVC with Wichita State anymore. We're talking about an MVC without Wichita State. And their top 5 was 80.
Wow.
So, yeah. So it's been a very, very painful start for the A10 this year.
So Rhode Island seems to be the best team. They're playing without E.C. Matthews, but they have a solid resume. They've picked up a couple solid wins out of the gate here. Is the only way that this league gets 2 at-large bids if Rhode Island doesn't win the A10 tournament?
And even then, it's
2 bids. Excuse me, 2 bids.
And even then, it's questionable. I mean, because we don't know what URI is going to do. I mean, you lost Matthews for a bit there. He's back. That's going to help. But you got a nice win over a team that I believe in, Seton Hall. That was a very nice win. Right. But you look at the losses they had, and they're not terrible losses. You lost to Virginia, who's 3rd in my rankings. You lost to Nevada, who's 33rd. And then at Alabama, who's come off to a slow start, and they're only 72nd, but those are respectable teams. So I could, if you told me at the end of the year that Rhode Island's going to finish the year with, 6 or 7 losses, yeah, I think they definitely have a chance to get in there as an at-large if they lose in the A10 tournament.
Yeah, they also have a win over Providence, so that might help them at the end of the year too.
Yep.
VCU is a team that scheduled really well out of the gate here. They played Texas, Seton Hall, a handful of other Virginia. They're 0-5 in those games, so they kind of just their at-large chances pretty much dwindled.
Yeah, I think they're in some trouble. They might have to rely on winning the A10 if they want to get in the tournament. I think there's a certain acceptance from VCU fans. The way I kind of looked at it was that this team was just not going to be the same team that we saw the last couple of years. So I mean, they did, like you said, the schedule strength is decent. What I calculate, the schedule strength is 37th. So they haven't played cupcakes. This is not like Georgetown's schedule, which is laughable. So they've played some good opponents, but yeah, you got to win those games. You got to beat Texas. You got to beat Virginia. You got to beat Marquette. You got to beat Michigan, and they didn't.
Absolutely. And St. Bonaventure might be the second best team in this conference. That's not a good sign.
No, it isn't. It isn't at this point. I know the same. I know the Bonnies fans really, want their team to be Duke, but they gotta do better than they've been doing. And they've got a pretty solid defense. They're 20th in defensive efficiency, but they're in the bottom half of Division I in offensive efficiency, and that doesn't bode well for a team if you want to be a contender.
And I will admit, we have a little scuffle with the St. Bonaventure people. Most of them don't like me, but looking at I think they're a good team, but looking at their non-conference schedule, I just don't think it's strong enough to garner an at-large possibility. Do you?
No. In fact, at this point, I think they're roughly in the same boat as VCU, and they're even a little bit lagging behind VCU. And I don't even think that VCU is that fantastic of a basketball team this year. I just don't see it. Now, that's not to say that teams can, go off on a huge run and win, 12, 14 games in their conference, but at this point, I'm just not seeing it right now. They've got a nice win against Maryland on a neutral court, but other than that, I'm not seeing anything that's terribly impressive on their resume.
No, they lost to TCU, and then they have a game against Syracuse, but Syracuse might not even be an NCAA tournament team this year. So I just don't see anywhere where it can really, push them into an at-large possibility. Like you said, unless they win 12, 14 games in a row or something like that.
Yeah, correct. I agree.
Yeah, another thing that's hurting this league this year is Dayton's taken a big step back. They're not half the team they were last year. They're not a good basketball team right now.
No, they're 100 spots down from where they were last year. Like I said, 47th last year, 141st this year. Just near, sitting at 4 and 5. Really mediocre across the board. Nothing special on offense. Nothing special on defense. It's a huge step back for a team that was one of the best in the A10 last year.
Yeah, in my opinion, VCU and Dayton are kind of the premier programs in the A10, and both those teams aren't very good this year. So it's just a really down year for the league.
Yeah, I think you're looking at one bid, and you might sneak URI in as an at-large, but, you're pushing your luck there even.
Absolutely. So, Erik, let's move on here. A team that I'm very intrigued by, and it's a very interesting team, is Nevada. They're a legit, in my opinion, top 25 club, but that non-conference schedule, they had opportunities. They had Texas Tech. They had TCU this past week. They lost both of them. So I'm unfortunately thinking that this team has to go on a really big run to even get in the conversation. What do you think about Nevada?
No, I like their chances. I think they have an excellent chance in an at-large. Right now, they're 33rd. And they have a great offense, 17th in the country in offensive efficiency. 2 losses, of course, but look at what their 2 losses were. You got a 6-point overtime loss at Texas Tech, a 4-point neutral court loss to Texas Christian. Very good teams. The thing I love about Nevada is Nevada's part of that Mountain West Conference, and I love the Mountain West. The analytics love the Mountain West this year. Right now, you've got the top 5 teams are rated 17th, 20th, 33rd, 36th, and 64th in the Mountain West, and 2 of them. You'd say, wow, they're that high. UNLV is 17, and Boise State is now up to 20. And people go, wow, Boise State. Well, how is that the case? Well, Boise State's got a great defense, 8th in defensive efficiency. And if I can kind of touch on, remember the 10th man, and this is where the analytics come in. You're going to see certain teams that I'm going to throw out there that you're not used to seeing. Well, if you've ever seen the movie World War Z, the example I like to use about the 10th man is when you have 9 people around a table in a committee and 9 of them agree, it is the duty of the 10th man to assume the 9 people are wrong and start thinking along those lines that those 9 people are incorrect. The analytics aren't exactly like that, but it kind of eliminates that groupthink mentality where it says, I don't care what the other people are going to think about. I'm going to say based on what the data I have, and I'm going to throw it out there. So when I throw out there Boise State, that's what I mean by that 10th man mentality. I'm challenging the status quo. The analytics are at least challenging the status quo and saying, hey, maybe we need to look at this Boise State team as being a legitimate, very solid Division I team. Because going into the season, nobody would consider Boise State a great contender. Nobody would consider UNLV to be as high as they have been. So that's when I mentioned before the 10th man mentality. That's kind of what the analytics bring to the table. They look at a lot of these different teams, and they treat them all equally. So a lot of these teams from like the Mountain West that are rising up are not popular picks by the mainstream media, but it forces you to think, kind of very similar to what SMU did last year in the AAC. That was a team that I think got all the way up to second in my rankings last year. Nobody really considered them, but they were a really, really good basketball team at the end of the season.
So, Nevada gets a win over Rhode Island, which certainly probably will help them. What do they need to do in during Mountain West play for you to feel comfortable at an at-large?
Well, that's the difficult part, because while the analytics can tell you a lot of possible true statements, at the end of the day, human beings are going to pick the field. And you saw what's happened the last few years with the likes of Wichita State and SMU. You can be as great as you are in the analytics world as you want. The people who do the eye test are the ones who decide who gets in, and they're looking at the archaic RPI and things like that. So I guess I don't really know what they'd have to do, because at the end of the day, the committee is going to decide their fate. Right. And we've known in the past now, at least they've been able to admit, hey, we need to start doing things a little bit better. You've seen some tweets out there about how the NCAA is now starting to implement a different formula as far as how they look at these teams and rate them. I'm hopeful that teams like Wichita State, SMU, or Nevada are going to benefit from this. But it's hard to say. It's really too soon to say what the NCAA is going to do. Yeah.
Did you feel like this league could possibly get multi-bids?
Oh, absolutely. I think they will get multi-bids. I would bet on it right now.
Okay. Well, I think you're kind of alone in that, but I trust you, obviously.
The reason I say that is because so many of the other conferences right now are not impressive. And we've seen, like we talked about the A10, who normally gets multiple bids. They may not get those multiple bids. The Big Ten, some of those teams are down. They may not get in. The Pac-12 has been arguably a little bit of a dumpster fire. Not to say that they can't recover, but a lot of these other conferences have not been impressive, and that opens up an opportunity, a window for conferences like the Mountain West to earn extra bids.
Okay. So up next, I wanted to talk about some teams and ask you if you think they're contenders or pretenders. We already talked about Arizona State. I think we both agree they're a contender. Not a national title contender per se, but maybe a conference champion contender. The other three I wanted to ask you about and get your opinion on. The first one's Florida State. Florida State's 8-0 right now. They got a big win at Florida last week. But other than that, I don't think the resume is all that good. What do you think about this Florida State team, and where do you have them in the rankings on your website?
Right now, they're 32nd in my rankings, but I'm going to go with pretender. And the reason for that is because as of yesterday, if you go to my website and you look at Florida State's team summary, I break things down into best performances and worst performances. The only thing in the best performances column yesterday was that beautiful win at Florida on December the 4th. That was it. Now there's a Fordham game in there that just barely squeaked in under best performances, but where they are in the rankings is largely on the shoulders of that Florida game. So I'm just not a believer that Florida State is they may be 32nd right now, but they got some work to do. I don't believe right now that Florida State is a legitimate contender.
I absolutely agree with you. I'm going to need to see more before I change my mind on that one. Now the next team, is Syracuse, a team we talked about a few minutes ago. Looking at their schedule, they have a nice win over Maryland. Their lone loss was to a Kansas team, no fault in that. They've also beaten UConn, who kind of looks a little dicey this year. What do you think about Syracuse?
I'm going to take a pass on Syracuse right now because I really need to see more. They're 49th in the overall rankings for me, but I just need to see more. They got that 16-point loss to Kansas. That's their only loss. The Maryland win was nice. The UConn win was nice, but again, you look at some of the teams they've beaten. Oakland 127th, Cornell 228th, Texas Southern 123rd. A lot of other teams in there: Colgate, Iona, UConn, and Toledo. All of them are 159, 161, 185, and 171. These are not, great teams. I need to sit. I think we're going to figure out who Syracuse is once the ACC schedule starts, and I'm going to probably pass on weighing in on Syracuse until then.
Okay, and is Houston kind of in that same boat for you? They're a team that's 7-1, scoring over 80 points a game, really explosive. They have a really nice win over Arkansas. They beat Arkansas by, I think, almost 30 points. What do you think about the Cougars?
Houston's 57th. I think Houston is what Houston is, and that what they are is very similar to what they were the last 2 years. They always hovered for me around that top 8 out of the field at the end of the year. And a lot of other people would look at that and go, well, I don't think Houston should be that high, but we always had Houston that high. I think they're going to be in the same boat again this year. I mean, they have a great win. They killed Arkansas by 26, which is a great win, but at the same time, there's a loss on their schedule to 218th ranked Drexel. So you don't really know what Houston is yet. And I looking at them, I suspect they're going to be roughly in the same boat that they were last year and the year before that. They're probably going to be in the conversation for the NCAA tournament, but knowing what their schedule is, typically you can't afford to lose a ton of games, and typically they end up losing 6 or 7, and if that happens again, they're not going to get in.
Well, one positive I think for Houston this year is the American Athletic Conference is much better, so they're going to have more opportunities for quality wins.
Yeah, I think that's going to. I mean, obviously, you bring Wichita State into the conversation. Yes, that's going to make the AAC better. So yeah, if you can knock off a team like Wichita State once or twice, that's going to boost your resume definitely. But again, it's probably, like you said, like Syracuse, it is probably too early to say on Houston.
For sure. Now, 2 upsets I wanted to talk about with you and see how much maybe they're going to affect your rankings in your opinion. The Washington win, which you said you were very surprised about over Kansas, and also BC over Duke. Starting with the Washington over Kansas. Now, that one wasn't as surprising to me. Washington does have some really good talent on that team. Noah Dickerson, one of the best bigs in college basketball. Jalen Noel is a really talented kid. David Crisp. What were your overall take from that game, and how surprised were you about the Huskies winning?
Yeah, the Washington game was a surprise, but I agree with you because after Washington went into that game against Kansas ranked 98th in my rankings. Boston College came out of the game against Duke yesterday ranked 98th after the win over Duke. So that means it was a much bigger upset. Now, Washington, I'm not sold on Washington. You got a 24-point loss to Virginia Tech in there. They barely beat Belmont. They barely beat Seattle. But it was one of those, it's hard to tell what Washington is. That's kind of puzzling. A lot of Kansas people said, well, it's not a big deal. It wasn't even on our home court. Well, as I had to remind them, hey, Washington had to travel 2,000 miles to it. Right. And then obviously the Kansas argument didn't fly today because they lost at home to Arizona State. But I think Washington moved up nicely as a result of that win. And Kansas, like I said, had kind of a nice little cushion up there above Villanova at number 1 until that loss. And that dropped them to number 2. Now, I suspect they'll drop a little bit further now after that loss to Arizona State. But, yeah, the Duke one was a big surprise. That's a BC team that lost at Nebraska by 9. They lost at Providence by 20. Nobody saw that coming.
I think the BC Duke game was a little bit of a mirage. Duke played terrible. BC couldn't miss. They hit 15 3-pointers. I just think it was one of those days. I don't think BC's a much better team because of the win or anything like that. What do you think?
Yeah, weird things happen all throughout the year. Right. Look at last year. North Carolina was the best team in basketball last year. They lost to Georgia Tech. Yet Indiana was a pretty good team last year. They lost to UEPUI. Even 2 years ago in the tournament, the Denzel Valentine Michigan State team losing to Middle Tennessee State. Just weird things happen. That's the great thing about college basketball. That's what makes it crazy and what makes it great.
Absolutely. So, speaking of Washington, I wanted to talk about the Pac-12 real quick. I have to, I think everybody agrees it's been an absolute dumpster fire. I mean, you had Arizona losing three games at the start of the season. You have the UCLA debacle in China, with the kids getting arrested.
Yeah.
Arizona State is like the talk of the conference right now. USC, another team, who's top 10 going into this season, they've really struggled out of the gate. They're 4-3. How little of bids do you think this league could get? Do you think this could be a 3-bid league possibly?
That's what I was thinking. I was thinking 3 would probably be the minimum. I'm not really. Arizona State looks for real. Right. Arizona, I'm not worried about Arizona. Arizona's got Elkins back now. They're up at, considering the hard times they had in the first month of the season, they're 7-3. They're still in the top 30 for me. They're 29th. Yeah. So the analytics still like them despite their bad start. And they're only going to get better. You got Elkins back now. He played very sparingly against Alabama, but he's going to get back in the mix, and that's going to be a very good ball team. I'm not worried about Arizona at all.
Arizona real quick. Arizona has wins over Alabama, Texas A&M, and UNLV in this past week. So they're starting to figure things out.
Yep, absolutely. And then USC will play when they want to play, and they're very much like UCLA was last year. USC needs motivation. And I cite the 2 tourney games in the tournament, the games in the tournament last year where they fall down 17 points to Providence and a dozen points to SMU. They hanker for a little competition, and if they don't get it, they kind of fall asleep. Very similar to what the Bruins did last year.
You're right, and they're playing without DeAnthony Melton right now, who is one of their best overall players. He's really good on both ends. He kind of does it all, so they could definitely use him. I can't really figure out what's wrong. I think it's more maybe of a chemistry issue, or like you said, they kind of only get up for really good teams. Because they shoot the ball well from deep. They're a deep club. They're solid on deep. They're not terrible on defense. They're solid. So I don't really think it's a kind of an on the court thing. I might think it's a little bit off the court.
Yeah, part of it is their defense has improved. They were 92nd last year. They're up to 58th this year, but their offense has regressed. Their offense was 32nd last year, down to 65th this year. It's just a team that hasn't shown any progression, which kind of surprises me because they have the talent. And sometimes you look at a team, and I'm always debating it, because sometimes you have a team you look at and you go, well, they're going to take it's largely the same players, but they're going to mature. And I think a good example of a team that is maturing is Texas Tech this year. I know you were high on Texas Tech last year from an experience standpoint, but they just couldn't put it together. I think this year you're seeing a very mature Texas Tech team. I think we expected a very similar situation with USC. They have the talent. They just have not matured yet. And that may happen during the year still. But right now they're at number 60. They're way down at number 60, which is almost exactly where they were all of early 2017. From like January 1st through mid-March, they hovered right around number 60. They're there again right now. There just hasn't been any progression. Not to say there won't be, but they just need someone to light a fire underneath them. They have the talent. They just need the motivation.
Yeah, and looking at the rest of the league, I think Stanford's been very underwhelming. They're dealing with injuries. I thought they were a team that could maybe step up this year and possibly be a tournament team. Oregon State as well. Oregon is a team that's kind of taken a big step back. I thought they'd still be a tournament team. They don't really look like it early on. What about UCLA though, Erik? This team's 7-2, not terrible with all that's going on with their program. What do you think about the Bruins? Where do you have them in your rankings?
The analytics have them pretty low right now. They're way down at 91st. And again, keep in mind, this is based on performance, not necessarily wins and losses. So when you beat the Wisconsin game, Wisconsin's 97th, you beat them by 2. That's actually considered for them a decent performance. What really hurts UCLA is the performances like an overtime victory over 184th ranked Central Arkansas, a 9-point win at home over 238th ranked CSU Bakersfield. Even a lax performance, a 3-point win over Georgia Tech, who's 142nd. That's the stuff that wears you down. And again, like I said, I don't look at wins and losses when it comes to the ratings. So those games are considered largely negatives, even though they're all wins. They're largely negatives. They should be blowing out Central Arkansas. They should be blowing out CSU Bakersfield, and they just haven't been.
For sure. Definitely disappointing. What do you think, off topic a little quick before we're going to finish up here in a few minutes. What's the best conference in college basketball right now, in your opinion?
Ooh, you know what? I'd almost have to go with the SEC. And I know the SEC was really propped up to be really solid this year, and they have, for the most part, delivered. And we're talking about an SEC where Kentucky really hasn't even played their best ball yet.
Right.
I mean, Tennessee has looked great. Texas A&M has really stepped up their game. Arkansas is solid, and then the analytics like Missouri as well. And we haven't even started to talk about Florida and Kentucky or Alabama at that point yet. Those teams have come out of the gate slower than expected. So I think the SEC, top to bottom, may actually be the best in basketball this year. I don't know if that'll be the case, but looking at the top 5 rankings, the average rankings of the SEC, it's 15.4. That's better than the ACC, which is 16. That's better than the Big 10, which is 18.8. Big 12, 17.4. So it's the best of all of those right now.
Wow. Yeah. It's a league that I tried to tell people all off season. This is a much better league. It's very deep. A lot of good coaches. I wouldn't be shocked if it's a 7 or 8 bid league this year. Is that a stretch for you?
No, absolutely. I think that's absolutely very reasonable to expect out of the SEC. 7, definitely. Put it in perspective. Vanderbilt is ranked as the worst SEC team in the country, or the SEC team in the conference right now. They're 121st. So that's not even that bad. You look at some of the lower ranked teams in some of these other conferences, and you go, wow, they're way down there. Look at Cal and the Pac-12, for God's sake. They're past 250. They're just beyond awful.
How bad was that loss for San Diego State yesterday to Cal at home?
Oh yeah, that was one that definitely hurt. San Diego State was let me see how far they dropped, because they were right around 20. This took them down to 36.
Wow.
Yeah, Cal, go figure about that one. They lose. They that was a team. Actually, they're up to 209th now. They were 255th yesterday, but that win got them up a few spots. But that team, 27-point loss to Central Arkansas, a loss to UC Riverside. Right. It's just horrible team.
Definitely. But, all right, before we finish up, Erik, I just wanted to ask you, when will we start seeing some bracketology from you this year? We've talked about this a bunch. What I love about you is you wait until there's a big enough sample size. You're not one of these other people that's putting out brackets, the third day of the season. What do you think is a big enough sample size to start bracketology?
And the thing is, I do actually list the bracketology on my site at all times, including it's there right now, but I don't advertise it because it's just way too early. We don't want to be. It's December the 10th. On January the 10th, I don't expect to really be talking about it too much, because you look at some of the stuff in my bracketology, what I call my bracketology deserves, and you got Middle Tennessee as a 4 seed. Right. You're using an algorithm that's going to be used at the end of the year that doesn't quite apply right now. So I throw it out there right now just for fun. It's so early in the year. I would never dream of saying, hey, here's what's going to happen in March, because it's painfully unrealistic. So I leave it out there right now, just as it's along the lines of watching a marathon and proclaiming a winner after the first mile. You can't do that. You have to let the whole race progress. And right now it's way too early. Obviously you have leaders after the first mile or second mile of a marathon, but that does not in any way imply who's going to win the marathon at the end. So while I show the deserves, I would not put a lot of stock in any of them right now.
Absolutely. And one more question I wanted to ask you, because you're into this stuff, is why does the committee continue to change, what they do? It seems like every year they have a new, we're going to do this now or that now. We're taking away this or adding that. Why can't they just decide on something and go with it?
I think it's the whole groupthink mentality. Part of the problem is you get more people involved in these people, the more it gets convoluted, the more, too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. I'll give them a lot of credit. They realized a couple of years ago that some of the picks they made were just bizarre in some situations. Last year, it made it easy on the committee, because I think most of the experts, the people who picked the brackets going into March, had pretty much all the 65 mapped out. We knew that Illinois State wasn't going to get in, probably. If you go to thebracketmatrix.com, you can see there that most of the people successfully picked who are those teams that got in. Now, when it came to the seedings, it got a little bit funky, and that was a little bit weird. But I think the committee, I think social media plays a part in it as well. I think there's a lot of questioning from a lot of the college basketball fan base of saying, what are you doing? And I think they've listened to a certain degree because remember last year they brought some of the analytics people in. They brought in Pomeroy and they brought in I'm trying to think of the guy's name from Michigan State, Pauga. He came in there as well, and they talked to those people and said, well, what are the what do you consider to be the positives in the team, and what should which teams should get in, which teams shouldn't. So I think it's a good thing that the NCAA is actually looking in the mirror a little bit and saying we haven't been doing everything okay. We need to change things a little bit better. I think they're going to get there eventually over time, but it's going to take some time to get there.
Absolutely. I think last year they did a really good job, but the seeding was pretty messed up.
Yeah, I agree. I think the ones I remember the one that really jumped out at me was Minnesota. Minnesota got a 5, and it was, are you kidding me? What have they done to deserve a 5? And then they matched them up with Middle Tennessee State, who was better than a 12, and Middle Tennessee State buried them. And then you go the year before that, Wichita State. What were they like an 11 or something like that? They come out there, they beat a 6, and they darn near beat a 3. They Miami played one of their best games in that postseason against Wichita State. But I think that these the analytics especially are starting to pull back the covers on these teams and saying, hey, you need to start seeing these teams better than you have, because you're really screwing some good teams over, and then you're propping up other teams who are going to be fodder for some of these better mid-majors. And I cite last year, Minnesota losing to Middle Tennessee.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for tonight's podcast, everybody. Erik, I really enjoy you coming on. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate it too.
Also, and again, guys, you can check out Erik's website, haslammetrics.com. Also, he's on Twitter at haslammetrics. So we'll be back next Sunday with another weekly recap. Also, you can check me out on Periscope on Wednesday night. Like usual, talking all things college hoops. We'll see you next week. Thanks.